Directors were afraid of him, his colleagues hated him, and at the same time, audiences laughed to tears at his every appearance. Mikhail Swetin, an actor who was called a comedic genius, and at the same time, an unbearable person. Raikin erased him from the theater. Danelia cut him from a film, and he would whisper backstage, "They kick me out because I'm a Jew." What was the real story behind the man with the cap? Why were his most famous roles born against a backdrop of humiliation, loneliness, and inner turmoil? How did one action rob him of the chance to apologize forever? You will find out how a legend became an outcast, but all the most important parts are closer to the end. He was born in Kyiv in the late 1920s, when the world was still under the shadow of great changes, and families like his were trying to hold on to the remnants of their fading prosperity. His father, the only son of wealthy parents, was used to an easy life from a young age. He didn't like to work and wasn't in a hurry to change his habits even when their former wealth evaporated. But life had its own way of setting priorities, and one day he had to get a job, though the real burden of responsibility fell on his wife's shoulders. She was a simple, strong woman who wasn't afraid of dirty work and carried the family forward, even when all their strength was spent on survival. They had a son, Mikhail, who couldn't be tamed from a young age, neither by his parents yelling nor by school remarks. He grew up like a small hurricane, loud, mocking, and wild. His younger brother was born a little later, and in the meantime, Mikhail would stage performances right in the kitchen, impersonating clowns, artists, funny teachers, and neighbors. He didn't hide his desire to become Charlie Chaplin, not just any actor or theater performer, but him specifically, the funny, tragic figure, the genius of silent mimicry. It was enough for him to have a stage, an audience, and their laughter. But life didn't let him be just a comedian. With the start of the war, they were evacuated to Tashkent, where there was no time for dreams, only for survival. Together with his mother, he sold goods at the market, looking for things to do with his hands and how to satisfy his hunger. His childhood ended abruptly, and instead of rehearsing scenes in the kitchen, there were piles of vegetables, calloused hands, and the heavy smell of other people's bodies in the crowded streets of Tashkent. Upon returning to Kyiv after the war ended, Mikhail seemed to try to get back on track, but the school he ended up in couldn't hold him. The lessons seemed boring, the teachers humorless, and his classmates too slow. He didn't join any clubs or dream of being an excellent student. He was interested in the stage, any stage. And if a school classroom could be a stage, he would turn it into his theater, asking absurd questions, interrupting lectures, imitating animals and teachers, and parodying politicians. At first, he was just scolded. Then his parents were called, and then the school's patience ran out. The last straw was an incident that is still remembered as both an amusing anecdote and a troubling event. Mikhail threw his teacher's bag out the window. It was no longer just a joke, but a challenge, and they responded to it. He was asked not to come back. That's how the attempt to fit Mikhail into the conventional system ended. He didn't give up. He just started looking for another form that his restless spirit could fit into. It didn't matter if it was a stage or a street, a classroom or a market. He wanted people to look at him, to listen to him, to laugh or get angry, but not to pass him by. And in this desire to be seen, a need, not just a dream, was already hidden. He didn't perform for the public. He couldn't breathe without it. When Kyiv was emptied by the roar of sirens and the rustle of anxious footsteps, Mikhail and his mother found themselves in the hot, foreign city of Tashkent, which had become a temporary home for thousands of others who had escaped the war. Everything that was dear and familiar had disappeared. There was no stage, no books, not even the very feeling of childhood. Now, all he saw were market stalls where no plays were staged. Here, they sold survival. His mother, as always, didn't complain. Gritting her teeth, she went to work, and Mikhail was by her side, with a bucket, a boat, with empty hands that were learning to count money, catch a buyer's eye, and quickly understand what they were afraid of and what they needed. The market became a school of survival, but not a stage. All that was left of the stage were memories of how great it was to impersonate Chaplin. When everyone laughed, now no one laughed. Oh. And yet, in Tashkent, Mikhail continued to act, but in a different way. He hadn't forgotten how to pretend, how to manipulate attention. Now, he was just playing the part of an adult who seemed to know what he was doing, when in reality, the opposite was true. When the war subsided, their family returned to Kyiv, as if on a narrow path through the surviving ruins of memory. It seemed like everything could start over, but the school, as we already know, no longer accepted Mikhail, and he found himself at a crossroads. He had to go to a trade school, anyone that didn't require more than 9 grades. The solution came unexpectedly. A conductor student rented a room in their family's home. His constant rehearsals, the sounds of the oboe, and the strange scales didn't repel Mikhail. On the contrary, they captivated him. He watched him with the same attention with which he used to watch performers on stage. This man controlled sound as if it were a different word. It was like magic. And Mikhail made a decision. Despite a complete lack of musical education, he came to the entrance exams and tried to get into the oboe class. His technique didn't save him, but his charm did. There was something about him that was hard to resist. The committee saw not a musician in him, but a person they wanted to remember. And they accepted him. The studies were not easy. He had to fight for everything, but Mikhail didn't give up, because he realized that as long as he was playing, he was alive. Even if it wasn't a stage, even if there was no laughter or applause, it was still a performance, musical, precise, and disciplined. And even though he didn't know where it would lead him then, he still went forward without asking himself unnecessary questions, because he couldn't live without a stage. And the oboe, even if temporarily, became its substitute. When Mikhail received his draft notice, he was no longer a wild, gusty teenager kicked out of school. He was a young man with an instrument in his hands, with a music school and a teaching job behind him. He was sent to the army, and it seemed that the theater had once again retreated to a hopeless later. But the army is a strange place, where boredom and discipline sometimes give birth to something completely different from what the commanders expect. There, amidst the gray everyday life, the same Mikhail who once dreamed of being chaplain came back to life. He ended up in the military orchestra. The oboe sounded again, but something else was much more important. At army events, something more than music was required, and that's when Mikhail started performing. Jokes, skits, and scenes. Everything that had built up inside him, he poured out in front of the officers. And one day, after a particularly successful performance, applause broke out. Real, sincere applause. Not because it was required, but because he had hit the bullseye, and this sound ignited him from the inside again. He suddenly realized that his dream hadn't gone anywhere. It had just retreated, pressed against the wall, but now it stood up again at its full height. The stage was calling, and as soon as his service ended, Mikhail went to Moscow without hesitation. To the capital, where the coveted theatrical universities seemed like heavens that could be touched if you jumped high enough. He came to the audition, confident that he could do it, with experience, with talent, with burning eyes. But he was not met with applause. He was met with frozen stares, dry rejections, and phrases that hid one thing: "You are too short." His height, 152 meters, about 5 feet, became a reason for ridicule and polite condescension. The gap between his teeth was another reason for rejection. Neither his voice nor his charisma nor his inner energy could overcome this external flaw. He heard, "You're not for the stage," again and again. Each failure hit his most vulnerable spot. Mikhail didn't understand why they didn't see him. He was ready for anything, to act, to study, to try. But around every corner, he was met with the same obstacles. And then he made a decision. If the door didn't open, he would go through the window or just break down the wall. And he chose a path that no one else would have dared to take. He decided to find a person who could believe in him. Bypassing committees and selections, he would find the only person who created a theater himself. The whole country knew this person's name: Raikin. He stood in the corridor of the institute, clutching a crumpled number in his hand, waiting for his name to be called. Inside, a mixture of fear and hope seethed, but he didn't let it out. He knew that if he showed weakness, he would lose. He went out in front of the jury confidently, loudly, holding his gaze straight. Poetry, prose, skits. He knew the program by heart, rehearsed at night, and brought every intonation to automatism. He tore the air, put his temperament and his soul on the table. But as soon as he finished, there was a pause, and the gaze was not on his eyes, but on his height. "What's your height?" 152. "The gap between your teeth is congenital." "Yes." Then followed a polite thank you, a promise to call back, and he would go out into the empty corridor, where he already knew no one would call. This was repeated at one theater institute, then another, and a third. His talent, charisma, and memorability all drowned in the first visual impression. Unprofitable, not theatrical, can't be made up. As if he were a defect, not a person. He was turned away from the very gates of his dream again and again. But the more he was pushed away, the tighter he clenched his fists. He didn't consider it a failure. He saw it as a challenge. He didn't need a paper certifying his acting talent. He needed a chance. A single moment when someone with power would look at him, not as a short man with a gap, but as an artist. He found out that Raikin, the most legendary artist of the time and the head of the miniature theater, a giant who was out of reach unless you got very close, was staying at a Moscow hotel. Mikhail began to stand guard at the entrance. Day after day, he sat on a bench, drank soda from a machine, fed pigeons, and pretended to just be out for a walk. But every day he waited. He looked at faces and searched for the right silhouette in the crowd. A week passed. Anyone else would have given up. But he waited, and one day he saw him. Raikin came out. Mikhail jumped up, intercepted him at the entrance, and started talking right away without ceremony, without preparation. "Just watch me, please." Raikin was stunned. Not by the aggression, but by the pressure, by this insane determination, by the way this short guy with a husky voice literally clung to a chance. He agreed, set a meeting, and Mikhail knew this was his ticket. No lines, no exams, no comparisons with the ideal profiles of other applicants. Just a stage, just him, just the truth. When Mikhail ran into the lobby, catching up with Raikin at the elevator doors, his breath was caught not from running, but from the realization that this might be his last chance. He spoke quickly, muffled, choking on his words as if he was afraid he would be interrupted. Raikin stopped, looked at him, and to Mikhail's surprise, didn't brush him off. Something in the eyes of this persistent guy hooked him. Not the request, not the words, but the look. It was the look of a person who couldn't live without the stage. He scheduled a meeting. Mikhail came to the audition, gathering everything he knew, could do, and felt. There, on the empty rehearsal stage, he seemed to dissolve into the air. All that was left was his voice, facial expressions, and energy. And something worked. Raikin nodded and accepted him. He saw not his height or his teeth, but his inner flame. That's how Mikhail Goltzman entered the theater he had dreamed of for thousands of sleepless nights. He was called an artist for the first time. He began to learn from the master himself, go on stage, and absorb the atmosphere of the backstage like a sponge. But in this fairy tale, something was wrong from the very beginning. He, who had knocked on doors for so long, suddenly began to act as if the theater now belonged to him. Everything that had built up inside him, resentment, pride, defiance, burst out. He started arguing with teachers, correcting mentors, interfering with rehearsals, and expressing his opinion about other people's roles. He wasn't just inconvenient, he was a storm. Mikhail seemed to be trying to prove to everyone that they wouldn't make him stand at a closed door again. But in this impulse, he didn't notice how he was starting to destroy what he had dreamed of. He started skipping classes and drinking. Once, he even overslept his own stage debut. Raikin forgave him the first time, but that wasn't the last straw. The last thing happened later when Mikhail, in a drunken outburst, allowed himself to say offensive things about Raikin's wife, and then a scene of a quarrel, almost a fight, with another actor. Then, Raikin didn't yell. He simply said that he would no longer go on the stage of this theater. The dream that he had hunted like a hungry animal turned out to be poisonous. It couldn't withstand the pressure. He himself had undermined it from within and realized it too late. He was kicked out without ceremony, with no hope of return. The theater, which had become an anchor, broke away, and Mikhail was left with nothing, but this time with the reputation of a troublemaker. And yet, even in this collapse, there was something undeniably honest. He went all the way, didn't bend, and didn't disguise his character. He couldn't live in a cage, even when it was gilded. But the price was frightening. The door slammed shut again, and there was no more Raikin, no stage, no teachers. All that was left was the job exchange and an offer that he accepted without hesitation, to go to the provinces, to start from scratch again. He had dreamed that the stage would change him, that by becoming an actor, he would find peace, respect, and stability. But reality was different. Instead of peace, Mikhail brought with him to the theater an insatiable desire to prove to everyone, and most of all to himself, that he was worthy of standing next to the best. He didn't tolerate instructions, interrupted masters during rehearsals, argued with directors, offered his own interpretations even where no one asked for them, and most dangerously, he began to teach Raikin himself, a man whose name meant more than titles and regalia combined. He didn't notice that behind this pressure was fear, the fear of being rejected again. He thought he was fighting for recognition, but in reality, he was defending himself, as if every glance, every remark was a challenge to his right to be on stage. Alcohol became a lubricant for his emotions, and along with it came sharpness, aggression, and arrogance. At first, his colleagues tried to get along with him. Then they distanced themselves, but the theater doesn't forgive repeated mistakes, and Mikhail made them one after another. He overslept a rehearsal, then ruined a performance. He allowed himself to say humiliating things about Raikin's wife. Even in a drunken tirade, everyone heard it. And then there was a fight. Short, rude, and confusing. Raikin, the man in whose eyes Mikhail was once a miracle, no longer saw anything in him but a threat. And one day, he simply put a stop to it. Without hysterics, without explanations, concisely, as if cutting off a superfluous branch. You are no longer in the troupe. This was a blow, but not the end. Mikhail didn't fall into depression or withdraw. He went first to the Volgograd region, to Komishin. There was no glamour of the capital's stage, no Raikin. But there was the main thing, a stage, and that was enough to breathe again. In the provinces, he unexpectedly found himself needed. There, where they didn't count centimeters of height or look at teeth, his talent was appreciated from the first appearance. He got roles, acted with a fury, with an inner fire that seemed to have only flared up after his defeat. And it was here that he met the one who was able to not just understand him, but to hold him. A young actress who was just entering the stage, Branislava Proskurnina. She was 17, he was 30. But in this collision of two souls, there was something truthful. She didn't see a troublemaker in him, she saw a person. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't try to prove anything to anyone. He was just by her side. Kamishin became not an exile for him, but a strange form of liberation. Here, no one knew his past, didn't remember the fights, and didn't compare him to Raikin. Here, they didn't judge him by his height and last name. They just watched him act, and that was enough. He went on stage. From the first rehearsals, it became clear. The man who was called unfit in the capital became a magnet here. His intonations, facial expressions, and liveliness all attracted attention. Mikhail began to breathe the stage again, as if he had never left it, and it was on these boards that he first saw her. Branislava was very young, just starting out. She was put on stage from an acting class, with a soft voice, large eyes, and a noticeable fear of making a mistake. Mikhail looked at her first as a mentor, with slight ironic condescension, and then suddenly with attention. She didn't know how to act like him, and didn't get a single round of applause, but there was a purity in her that disarmed him. And what happened between them began not with passion, but with a simple human conversation. He told her stories. She listened. He impersonated famous actors, and she laughed, not because she had to, but because she couldn't help it. And the more he was with her, the less he felt the need to be someone else on stage. He finally began to be himself. It was hard for them. Neither he nor she had stability, money, or an apartment. But they had the main thing, a feeling that didn't require excuses. He was older, more hot-tempered, with a burden of failures. She was young, romantic, and naive. And yet they got married quietly, without celebrations, without loud words, simply because they could not be together. Since then, their wandering from theater to theater began. They moved from city to city, from one troupe to another. Everywhere, Mikhail started from scratch, proving again and again that talent is not about height, status, or a diploma. And Branislava followed him. She didn't make a scene, didn't demand a diamond ring, or a house with a garden. He was enough for her. Even when he was irritable, quarrelsome, and stubborn, he acted, she waited. He got angry, she forgave. Their life was like a play without scenery, without a clear ending, but with real living emotions. And in this strange, chaotic movement, they were looking for one thing, a place they could call home, where he would become a needed actor again. And she would be not just a wife, but a part of his stage. They settled in Leningrad, tired of moving, with accumulated suitcases, worn-out posters, and notebooks with lines. It seemed the city accepted them, not with enthusiasm, but without rejection either. Mikhail started getting roles, small but noticeable. And Branislava thought more and more about the future, not a theatrical one, but a real domestic one. She was afraid that if she didn't decide now, time would slip away unnoticed forever. When their daughter was born, everything changed. Mikhail looked at the newborn for a long time, as if he couldn't believe that out of all the chaotic and sometimes destructive turns of his life, something so fragile and pure could appear. The girl was named Svetlana, a name that, as he said, lit up his world. From then on, an anchor appeared in his life. Not the theater, not fame, not recognition, but her, a small being for whom he suddenly started to speak more quietly and slam doors less often. But there was one more step. He no longer wanted people to look at him through the prism of his last name. In his past, the name Goldsman was often a source of sideways glances, hidden distrust, and prejudice. He felt how it worked, not directly, but from the inside. And one day, he made a decision that no one had asked for, but which became an act of protection for him. He took a last name derived from his daughter's name and became Svetin. It wasn't a pseudonym for a theatrical sound. It was a statement. He was no longer a son of his parents, an actor in exile, or a student of Raikin. Now he was a father. And if anyone was to determine his destiny, it wasn't an editor, a production council, or a committee, but her, Svetlana Svetin. This name became his armor, and the birth of his daughter was the point where his real life began. Now, he acted not only for the sake of the stage, he acted for the sake of home, for breakfast in the morning, for the first doll he hid in his coat pocket to surprise her, for the children's laughter in the kitchen, for the family he wanted to save at any cost. And from that moment on, his path was no longer lonely. In every choice, in every line, in every appearance on stage, he was no longer followed by the shadow of failures, but by the warm light of her name. By the time the phone rang with an unexpected offer to act in a film, Mikhail was already 44. He took this age, at which many actors begin to take stock, as a starting point. Before that, there had been dozens of plays, dozens of moves, dozens of attempts to stay afloat. But cinema, that was the childhood dream of, I want to be Chaplin. Only now, it was without laughter, without naivety. Now, it was serious. He came to the set not as a novice, but as a person who had been ready for everything for a long time. His face didn't need makeup. It was a painting in itself. He didn't need to be told how to act. He felt the scene like his own skin, and everyone around him felt it. The very first scene with him was a bullseye. He didn't just play a funny person, he was one. And not in a staged or two-dimensional way, or according to a given script. He lived inside every scene. From that moment on, offers poured in one after another. Directors were drawn to him, not for his name or for fashion, but for what he could do better than anyone else. Bring a text to life. Mikhail didn't have beautiful diction or a slender figure, but he had magic. He would enter the frame, and you wouldn't want to turn him off. But along with this came another side. He was irritating. He argued, gave instructions, and wasn't afraid to say to someone's face that a dialogue was weak, a scene wasn't working, and a character was a cardboard cutout. For many, this was unbearable. He wasn't an actor who was easy to fit into a box. He had to be accepted as he was, with his character, with his inner storm, with unexpected bursts of anger. Directors often gritted their teeth, enduring his remarks. He could utter a phrase like, "You can't shoot it like that," right in the middle of a scene. He argued about motives, tone, and intonation. Sometimes it seemed as if he was just provoking people to feel a sense of control. But even the most short-tempered understood that he wasn't doing it on a whim. He was fighting for the role as if it were the truth. They tolerated him because they knew that in the end, the scene would turn out in a way that no one else could do. He didn't play a type. He turned even the most minor role into a life. That's why Mikhail Svetin, who appeared on screen so late, managed to star in more than 100 films. He didn't need time to warm up. He had simply finally found himself where he belonged from the very beginning. With Leonid Gaidai, he had a special alliance. Not a friendship, not a partnership, but something more strange and unpredictable. Gaidai, a master of precise jokes and absurd comedy, saw in Svetin an actor who didn't need explanations. Mikhail, in turn, felt that Gaidai was a rare director who could pull everything dormant out of an actor. Their collaboration was like a dance on broken glass, a reserved respect, a hidden irritation, a professional attraction. Gaidai tolerated Svetin longer than many. Mikhail, by habit, argued, interfered with the script, offered alternative stage directions, and even corrected the intonations of other actors. Sometimes this irritated the entire film crew, but Gaidai would clench his fingers, pause, and then give him the scene again, because he knew that the result would justify the nerves. They shot several films together, and it seemed that this tandem could work forever. But one day, Mikhail received a new script from Gaidai and suddenly refused. He called the role a cliché, unworthy, and weak. He spoke sharply, with the same confidence that had previously pushed him into conflicts. Only this time, everything was different. Gaidai didn't try to persuade him. He simply accepted the refusal and closed the script. In that second, a bridge seemed to collapse between them. Later, Mikhail realized that he had gone too far. He was going to go and talk to him, apologize. He understood that he had lost his temper, that he had acted proudly and foolishly. But the moment was missed, and as it happens in life, the chance was gone. Gaidai passed away, unexpectedly, quickly, as if by the law of drama, in which the ending always comes too early. Svetin was silent, not publicly, but inside himself. He didn't make excuses or talk in interviews about how he wanted to make up. He simply carried it within him like a foreign guilt that he couldn't give away. His stubbornness, which had given him strength in other situations, turned into emptiness this time. He continued to act, to perform, to argue. But after the story with Gaidai, he started to say no less often. And when directors offered him roles, he looked less often at the depth of the text and more at the opportunity to be close, to work, to make the scene come alive. And perhaps, somewhere deep down, he imagined what that role he had rejected would have sounded like. With Georgi Danelia, everything seemed to start smoothly for Mikhail. The great director, who had a keen sense of actors' intonations, invited Svetin to act in a film, again for a minor but memorable role that he could turn into a miniature within a big film. Mikhail entered the project with enthusiasm, worked precisely, caused laughter on set, and offered solutions. Danelia listened, agreed, and praised him. It seemed like a rare case where Svetin's character didn't conflict, but complemented the plan. But, as always, everything broke down suddenly, and for no reason. There was very little left until the end of filming. Danelia, like all directors of his caliber, demanded precision. He needed to reshoot a couple of scenes, dub some episodes, and maybe stay for a few days. All of this was part of the normal filming routine, but Mikhail unexpectedly said no. He explained his refusal by saying that he had another event. He said it was important, didn't apologize, didn't offer to reschedule, and just refused. Calmly, coldly, without looking back. Danelia was shocked, not because the actor refused, but because of how he did it, without respect, without a minimal sign of partnership. And then the director made a tough decision, not to wait, not to persuade. He took another actor, not for filming, but for dubbing, and the voice that the audience heard in the film was no longer the voice of Mikhail Svetin. This replacement became a humiliation for Mikhail. He wasn't used to being erased after working. His face on screen, someone else's voice behind the scenes. His movements, someone else's intonation. It was a blow to the very thing he had always clung to, his uniqueness, his I. Later, he recalled this story with bitterness, saying that he had acted thoughtlessly and admitting he was wrong. But there was nothing that could be done to fix it. The breakup wasn't loud or scandalous, but it was final. Danelia never called him again. And Mikhail understood that this was a case where it would have been enough to just say yes and stay for one day. And the story would have gone a different way. But he was once again a hostage to his own character. Every such breakup left a scar on his biography, and although the audience didn't see it, inside Mikhail, the understanding grew that not all bridges can be rebuilt. Some burn down immediately, without a chance to return. He knew how to enter the frame in a way that made the camera come to life immediately. His appearance didn't need an explanation. He instantly attracted attention, even if he only said a couple of phrases. But behind this artistic light, a shadow was increasingly hidden. Mikhail would snap, argue, and conflict not only with directors, but also with cameramen, sound engineers, and even prop masters. He could flare up over the wrong lighting, the wrong pause, or the wrong look in his direction. Colleagues, especially new ones, would first be confused and then start to avoid him. He could seem cheerful and be the life of the film crew, and an hour later, he could be unpredictable, caustic, and hurtful. He hurt people with words, with irony, without raising his voice, but with perfect aim and often publicly. For many, this was unbearable, but behind this wasn't superiority, but fear. His outbursts weren't an expression of strength, but an attempt to defend himself. Mikhail had long lived with what he didn't say out loud, with an inner feeling of being unsuitable. He felt that he wasn't accepted for who he was. His height, appearance, last name, and age, all of this had been weighing on him for decades. And even when he became recognizable, when the public didn't care what he looked like, he lived with the conviction that he had to prove his right to the stage all over again every time. He was afraid that he would be forgotten, that they would say, "You don't fit again." And so, he would preemptively attack first. Behind this hid a complex that had grown since his youth, from those rejections at universities, from the mockery, from the rejected roles. He didn't know how to forgive himself for his weaknesses, and didn't let others relax. It was an aggressive, prickly armor, but inside it lived a person who desperately needed to be accepted. And only years later, when everything around him had calmed down a bit, when his status no longer required confirmation, Mikhail began to admit to himself and others, yes, he was difficult. Yes, he destroyed bridges. Yes, he often regretted it, but it was too late. He asked for forgiveness, sometimes publicly, sometimes by phone, sometimes just by meeting someone's gaze, without unnecessary words. But there was one thing he always said out loud. He wasn't playing the part of a comedian, he was hiding behind one. Behind the wide smile, behind the signature grimace, behind the funny intonation, was a person who was in pain. And the louder the audience laughed, the quieter he became inside. She knew who she was marrying. Even in the first months, before the marriage certificate and the vows, she felt that living with Mikhail would not be easy. He wasn't just short-tempered, he was fire in a person's body. His mood could change in a second. He could slam a door in response to silence. He could leave a rehearsal because someone looked at him the wrong way. And yet, she stayed. Branislava didn't make a scene. She didn't try to re-educate him. She was just there, wherever his life was playing out, on a provincial stage or in a capital city studio. She followed him, sometimes in his shadow, not seeking applause, sometimes with anxiety in her voice when he snapped at others, but she didn't leave. There were nights when she cried, there were times when she thought about leaving, and once she even packed her suitcase. But she stayed not out of pity, but out of love. Such women are almost non-existent, not loud, not public, not striving to be in the center, but enduring what no one else could endure. And perhaps, only because of her, Mikhail didn't completely destroy himself. She didn't set conditions, didn't threaten to leave, didn't lecture him, but her silence, her presence was more powerful than any words, and he knew it. He spoke about it rarely, was embarrassed, but admitted it. Only she knew how not to be afraid of him when he was afraid of himself. As the years went by, She became his anchor, his return home. And when everything collapsed, roles, contracts, friendships, he knew that Branislava would be there, sitting in the kitchen, pouring tea, opening a window, and waiting for him to cool down. Not out of obligation, but out of a loyalty that required no proof. With his daughter, he was completely different. Svetlana didn't know her father as a tyrant. She didn't see his outbursts in the theater. For her, he was warm, attentive, and gentle. He taught her to look at the world with a smile, but didn't allow her to be frivolous. He read to her out loud, took her to the park, and made toys from improvised materials. He called her "my light," not as a play on words, but for real. And for her, he once changed his last name. Later, when Svetlana got married and moved to America, Mikhail was initially worried. But when his granddaughters, Anna and Alexandra, were born, everything changed. He lived for their visits, their voices on the phone, their photos. He could spend hours looking at the screen, rewatching videos of them reading poems or dancing. For them, he was a kind grandfather, a little absent-minded, with a worn book in his hands and endless stories. None of them knew Mikhail the troublemaker. None of them saw his sharp gestures or heard his biting remarks. For them, he was comfort and sunshine. And perhaps it was in these girls that he found what he had been missing all his life. Unconditional love, without a stage, without roles, without competition, simply because he existed. And in their voices, laughter and hugs, he seemed to thaw, fall silent, and be truly happy. Over the years, he became a different person. The same explosive Mikhail, whose reputation always preceded him, seemed to have lost his sharp edges. He was still demanding, and still knew how to tell the truth to someone's face, but he did it more quietly and calmly. His voice became softer, his gaze warmer, and the pauses in his conversations longer. He began to look at people, not at roles. He called old acquaintances, those with whom he had once argued until he was hoarse, and wrote short letters, not with a direct apology, but with phrases that hid everything. "I remember. Forgive me if I went too far. You were right." He began to admit publicly and privately that he was not always right, that the stubbornness for which he was once respected was not a strength but a shield, and that because of it, he had lost too much. He no longer wanted to fight with anyone. The need to prove his worth disappeared, simply because now he knew his worth without a fight, without noise, without conflicts. He learned to let go and for the first time allowed himself to be weak in a good way. Peace was not boring. It became a stage on which Mikhail played himself. Not a role, not an image, not a function, but a person who had finally learned to be close to others. He walked with his wife, wrote to his grandchildren, and read books he hadn't had time to open in his youth. And perhaps for the first time, he felt that he didn't have to rush. But even in this silence, where there were no more castings or filming, there remained a stage. Not the one with lights and applause, but the one that lives in memory. He remained in voices, in frames, in intonations. He was remembered not for his roles, but for the feelings he evoked. He was someone who didn't just act. He lived in the frame. Someone who couldn't be confused with anyone else. And after his death, everything seemed clear. The story was lived. The ending was set. But suddenly, a strange parallel arose, which people began to whisper about. A comparison that no one had thought of before. Svetin and Yeremenko. Mikhail, hot-tempered, loud, and real. And Nikolai, silent, reserved, as if he deliberately hid everything personal from the world. And only after this, everything became clearer. Mikhail lived with an open heart. He made mistakes out loud, loved loudly, and burned out in front of everyone's eyes. And Nikolai, rumor had it that after he died, he left behind letters, locks, secret correspondence, and unfinished business that no one could decipher. Svetin, who was feared for his directness, in the end turned out to be extremely open, and Yeremenko was a mystery. And if one left behind laughter, pain, memories, and a trace that is visible even in the shadows, the other left behind a silence that people are still trying to understand. Perhaps this is the paradox. True brightness is not in who was louder, but in who could not be forgotten. Not for their character, not for their weaknesses, not for their mistakes, but for their truth.